The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Welcome back to Things Are About to Get Weird. Thank you so much for joining me today for a brand new episode, and one which has been on my list for a very long time indeed. In a couple of our previous episodes, I've mentioned that a deep dive into the dark history of the lobotomy could be an entire installment of the podcast in itself, and lots of you have said that you'd be fascinated to hear it. So here we are. I must give you the usual disclaimers before I launch into this kind of subject matter. I am not a doctor, a psychologist, or any kind of medical professional. I'm just someone who is very interested in this topic and has spent time reading about it. Also, as you may expect, there will be many mentions of mental health conditions within this episode, as well as some gruesome surgery details and discussions of people taking their own lives. So, as always, please do bear that in mind before choosing to listen today. Those warnings given, let's begin. How many times have you been watching a film or TV show, reading a book, or scrolling around the internet and have come across a glib reference to the medical procedure known as a lobotomy? These days it's usually used for comic effect, with a person or character exclaiming that they'd rather undergo the antiquated operation than do X, Y, or Z alternative task, or jokingly wishing for one after experiencing a mildly unpleasant situation. But perhaps unsurprisingly, like the root of many points of dark humour, the reality of the lobotomy was no laughing matter. Though on paper they were meant to make a distressed patient calmer and more subdued, the end results were often very different indeed. So to understand why, let's head all the way back to the beginning, the very beginning, because although many articles you'll read mention the first formal lobotomies that were performed in the 1930s, they were actually inspired by practices that stretch all the way back to the 1880s, practices devised by a Swiss doctor named Gottlieb Burckhardt, who is largely believed to be the first person to carry out modern, in inverted commas, psychosurgery. At the time, Burckhardt oversaw operations at a Swiss asylum, and after spending time witnessing the psychological distress many of the patients there were living through, he began to wonder whether there could be a surgical route to help treat them. Now, the way I've phrased that is perhaps a little too kind, because it's long been speculated that his motivations could have leaned more towards subduing the patients to help make the lives of those working at the asylum easier, rather than actually helping the individual suffering from a mental health condition. But we'll get more into that later. Anyway, after having this idea, Dr. Burckhardt set his plans in motion. He decided to test the theory that by removing part of a patient's cerebral cortex, literally part of their brain, he could put a stop to symptoms of what we now know to be conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. He performed operations on 6 of the asylum's residents, and the results were both varied and tragic. Whilst 2 of the patients did become quieter and seemingly more pacified, 2 others showed no change at all. Sadly, 1 patient died shortly after the surgery, whilst another actually took their own life after undergoing the procedure. Now, Dr. Burckhardt was keen to share what he had learned from these surgeries with the wider medical community at the time, but it's safe to say that his work was not well received by everyone. In fact, after he presented his findings to the Berlin Medical Congress in 1890, the backlash about his unconventional methods was so huge that he was effectively ostracized by his peers, and he soon stopped performing these psychosurgeries. It's important to say that this operation wasn't the lobotomy as we know it now. It was actually called a tepectomy, but Burckhardt was seen as paving the way for those who came after him, so allow me to introduce you to them. One of the first names you're likely to come across when researching the history of the lobotomy is Dr. Chyaz Moniz. Moniz was a Portuguese neurophysician who, in 1935, felt the same pull that Dr. Burkhardt had decades earlier, the desire to find out whether a surgical approach could relieve the symptoms of severe mental health conditions in humans. Dr. Moniz, encouraged by recent experiments conducted on 2 poor chimpanzees by scientists in America, believed that by separating the frontal lobe from the rest of the brain, he could achieve the results that Dr. Burkhardt hadn't quite been able to. The details of exactly what this early lobotomy, or leucotomy as he dubbed it, actually involved is grim to say the very least. An article from the BBC that I read summarised it incredibly well by saying, quote, "His procedure involved drilling a pair of holes into the skull and pushing a sharp instrument into the brain tissue. He then swept it from side to side to sever the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain." I wouldn't say that I'm a particularly squeamish person. General footage of surgery doesn't really bother me, for example, but there's something about this description that just turns my stomach. Probably because of how barbaric it sounds, and I am far from alone in feeling this way, as we'll come to learn. The sharp instrument used in the procedure was known as a leucotome, hence the term leucotomy, and after Dr. Moniz reported promising results from the first 20 operations he performed, he caught the attention of another doctor whose name was destined to become forever associated with the practice, the American neurologist Walter Freeman. Now, Freeman was an interesting character by all accounts. I've seen him described as equal parts physician and showman, which immediately took me back to the research I did for our Victorian medical practices episode. And as you may remember from that episode, this combination is usually not a good thing. Freeman decided to take what Moniz had been doing and run with it over in America, and in 1936 he teamed up with a surgeon named James Watts to perform their first lobotomy. They did things a little differently though, and took the experimentation aspect of this operation to new levels, all with the same end goal of separating out parts of the frontal cortex. These techniques ranged from pumping alcohol into the brain to, for lack of a better term, using needles to suck out various parts of it in order to sever these neural connections. I'm so sorry, I know this is all so graphic, but I think it's vital to understand just how invasive these surgeries were, and the more you learn, the worse it gets. One of the main factors I'm referring to when I say this is the fact that these operations were performed blind, in the sense that the surgeons couldn't actually see what they were doing, as the patient's skulls weren't actually opened up. Everything was initially done via these holes in the skull, so there was a huge amount of guesswork going on each and every time, which is a terrifying concept when it comes to literal brain surgery. And I'm sorry to say that once again, it only got worse, in my opinion. So much worse. This is so incredibly frustrating to even discuss, but the reality was that the more lobotomies Freeman and his fellow doctors performed, especially in the US, the more apparent it became to them that the procedures were incredibly time-intensive. Whilst working at the St. Elizabeth's Mental Health Hospital in Washington, D.C., Freeman proclaimed that he wanted to make the lobotomy quicker and easier, so that the patients could get out of hospital in much less time. Call me cynical, but I suspect another motive was also to make his own life easier and career more profitable in the process, but I digress. So in 1946, he came up with the operation I think most people would immediately associate with this topic in general, the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure that became so famous or infamous partly due to the specific medical tool that was used within it, a steel instrument that essentially looked like an ice pick. This is horrible, so brace yourselves. But what this transorbital lobotomy involved was the hammering of the ice pick type implements into the brain through the bones at the back of the eye sockets. Oh, it doesn't bear thinking about. This method was significantly faster than the previous techniques, taking just 10 minutes on average, and it didn't require the patient to be put under anesthetic either. Instead, the surgeons used a device called an electroshock machine to put the patient under before the procedure began. Everything about this just feels wrong, doesn't it? But it doesn't end there. You see, although the lobotomy was originally intended to be a last resort style of treatment for patients, as it grew in popularity, this shifted quite drastically. Dr. Freeman actually became a traveling physician, performing around 3,500 lobotomies all around the US, training others on how to carry them out whilst he was at it. And at this point, the reasons for a patient being recommended a lobotomy was quite startling. Serious mental illnesses were still on the list, but so were ailments including insomnia, nervous indigestion, and even chronic headaches. What we now know as obsessive-compulsive disorder was also on the list, which is particularly alarming to me as someone who deals with it daily. Now, over here in the UK, it took until the 1940s for the idea of lobotomies to really land, but when it did, it landed with a bang. According to a BBC article I read, surgeons in the UK actually ended up performing proportionally more lobotomies than in the US, if we take population percentages into account, with around 1,000 of the operations being carried out per year on average. Renowned neurosurgeon Dr. Wiley McKissick was the most prolific doctor in the UK in terms of performing these procedures, and it's believed he conducted around 3,000 lobotomies in total, with each taking just 5 minutes for him to carry out. It wasn't just the US and the UK though, of course. At this time, lobotomies were happening all over the world. In 1949, Dr. Maniz was even awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine for his work in devising and developing the lobotomy. However, as popular as the operation had become, its success wasn't destined to last forever. It was in the mid-1950s that the meteoric rise of this procedure began to stall, and by the time we reached the 1960s and 70s, the number of lobotomies being performed continued to fall rapidly. This decline continued as the decades progressed, with things like the 1983 Mental Health Act in the UK really changing the landscape in terms of what kind of treatments were acceptable. And today, any kind of psychosurgery is incredibly rare, and when it is performed, it's a whole lot more accurate and well thought out than the lobotomies of the 40s and 50s. So that is a whirlwind overview of the practice of the lobotomy, and those who gained fame and recognition for popularizing them. But what about the patients, those whose lives were changed forever or even cut tragically short by the advent of this strange and brutal new medical treatment? As dark as the surgeries themselves were, when we start to look at the effects of lobotomies on the real people who were on the receiving end of them, this tale begins to, at times, feel a whole lot more sinister. Now, one of the biggest arguments in favour of the lobotomy was that it was viewed as a better alternative to more traditional treatments, which were often, it's fair to say, also pretty dire. It's well known that patients suffering from severe mental health conditions were not always treated with care within asylums and hospitals, and it was argued that a medical procedure was surely preferable to a life lived in a padded cell wearing a straitjacket. Physical violence was frequently inflicted on those held in these facilities, whether as a method of control or a punishment, and many were doomed to spend the rest of their lives within these institutions. Those who championed the lobotomy would often cite these points when making their case in support of the experimental procedure, and whilst this is understandable to a certain extent when you consider that they simply didn't have the kind of medicine and pharmaceuticals that we have today, which can help to treat certain mental health conditions, this argument only stretches so far for me. Aside from the brutal nature of the operation, the success rate simply wasn't compelling enough. For example, in a review of Dr. McKissick's patients in the UK, it was found that whilst around 1/3 benefited from their lobotomy, another third experienced no change at all, whilst the final third were actually worse off afterwards. Some patients were left without the ability to communicate or walk or feed themselves, and in numerous cases they were left awake but unresponsive permanently. In the US, Dr. Freeman's patients had a fatality rate of 15%, which works out to hundreds of lives which were lost. Those statistics are shocking to me. It's incredible that lobotomies went on for as many years as they did, but what's even more shocking, although not entirely surprising if you know anything about the history of medical practices, is that certain demographics of patients were given lobotomies at hugely inflated rates. At the time, a large percentage of people who were sent to asylums in the US were gay men. The history around this is incredibly dark and could easily be a whole episode in itself, but it's safe to say that the treatment of these men was diabolical. They were essentially tortured in many of these institutions, incorrectly labelled as sex offenders and told that their homosexuality was something that needed to be cured. And when the practice of lobotomy emerged, a large number of the operations performed were on gay men, often against their will. Dr. Freeman even said at the time, quote, "It would appear that homosexuality is of little practical importance after frontal lobotomy." It is genuinely heartbreaking. Another key demographic who suffered at the hands of these surgeons were women. I'm going to read an excerpt from an academic paper by Mary Koziol on the subject, as it's very eye-opening. Mary writes, "A comprehensive study of all psychiatric institutions and general hospitals with psychiatric wards in the United States between January the 1st, 1949 and June the 30th, 1951 shows nearly 60% of the lobotomy patients were women, although men significantly outnumbered women as patients at the majority of these institutions. This disparity was noted by many practitioners at the time. One neurosurgeon with approximately 2 times more female than male lobotomy patients sought to explain and justify the gap. Quote, "One of the criteria for surgery on chronically ill patients has been disturbed behavior, and female patients are generally more disturbed on a behavior level." End quote. It's always disappointing but never surprising, hey? It wasn't just in the US either. In Sweden, for example, in most of the lobotomies performed between 1944 and 1966, most of the patients were women. It's often noted that in many cases, these lobotomies were actually performed against the woman's will or even against their knowledge altogether. And speaking of a lack of informed consent, we arrive at yet another disturbing junction within this story: the use of lobotomies on children. Some of the details in this next section are very upsetting, so if you would prefer to skip ahead a little in this episode, that's totally understandable. But I feel I'd be doing a disservice to those who were affected as children not to mention them. Their stories deserve to be heard. In the US, of Dr. Freeman's 3,500 patients, 19 were thought to be children, with the youngest of these children being just 4 years old. It's very difficult to find information on this poor child. All I was really able to uncover was that he was a little boy, but I think his age alone tells us all we need to know about how horrific it was that this procedure took place. It's terrible. But one child who we do know much more about is Howard Dully. In December of 1960, Howard was just 12 years old and living in San Jose, California. He was a slightly withdrawn child who got into arguments with his brother and acted out around his father and stepmother, but on the whole, he was a fairly typical preteen boy. I mean, who amongst us could honestly say that we never talked back to our parents or argued with our siblings or other family members as young people? But unbeknownst to Howard, he was about to become a very exceptional child indeed, for all the wrong reasons. On the 16th of December that year, he was given a lobotomy by Dr. Freeman at his stepmother's request. And although he has hazy memories of the event, he wasn't told exactly what had happened to him for decades. Is this not one of the most heinous things you've ever heard? In a 2005 interview, Howard revealed some details of what his life had been like since, saying, "By some miracle, it didn't turn me into a zombie, crush my spirit, or kill me, but it did affect me deeply. Walter Freeman's operation was supposed to relieve suffering. In my case, it did just the opposite. Ever since my lobotomy, I felt like a freak, ashamed." A couple of years after this interview, Howard went on to publish a book about his experience and became one of the leading voices speaking out about the brutality of the practice. He also revealed that whilst Dr. Freeman told his family he was suffering from schizophrenia, numerous other doctors had found no signs of mental illness within Howard whatsoever. Howard's story is well worth reading further into. He was remarkably brave to speak out in the ways that he did. And as he passed away last month at the age of 76, I feel it's a fitting tribute to him that we're speaking about this topic today. Thankfully, it seems that Howard was able to go on and live a full life in many respects. He held a full-time job, was married with a son and a stepson, and aside from a few ailments like frequent eye infections, as he believes the lobotomy destroyed his tear ducts, he didn't seem to suffer from too many long-term physical effects of the operation. But when you read interviews with Howard, it's clear that the mental toll was much greater. And I can only hope that by speaking out, he was able to lessen this burden and finally feel all of the support he clearly didn't receive as a vulnerable 12-year-old. Now, whilst we're speaking about notable lobotomy patients, it would be impossible to put this episode together without mentioning one of the most famous cases of all time. A case that, whilst more high profile than Howard Dully's, sadly had a very different overall outcome. I am, of course, talking about Rosemary Kennedy, sister of former US President John F. Kennedy. Interestingly, what you learn about Rosemary's story very much depends on the source of your information. Whilst resources like the JFK Library website talk about how Rosemary had experienced learning difficulties since she was a child, became more unruly and, quote, difficult as a young adult, and was ultimately given a lobotomy to help address this behaviour, other accounts state that while she did learn at a slower rate than her siblings, she made good progress as she got older, and in her early 20s, she was a vibrant young woman who was full of life. She loved social occasions and was said to enjoy dating and spending time with different men, which, given the social standing of her family and the fact that this was the 1940s, was frowned upon at the time. In 1941, when Rosemary was just 23 years old, her father, Joseph Sr., decided that a new medical procedure he had heard about could help to regulate his daughter's behaviour, something which would be a welcome development, given the fact he was spending his time preparing two of his sons for a life in politics. Anything that could reduce the risk of his family's reputation being tarnished could only be a good thing, right? Well, not for poor Rosemary. In November of that year, she was given a lobotomy by none other than Dr. Freeman and James Watts, entirely without her knowledge or permission. But the surgery didn't exactly go to plan. Soon after it was completed, it became abundantly clear to Rosemary's family that the procedure had left her severely disabled. She could no longer walk, speak properly, or fully take care of herself. As a result, she was immediately placed into an institution, Craig House, before being moved to another facility in Wisconsin a few years afterwards, once she had regained some of her movement. But surely her family still continued to be involved in her life after making a decision that destroyed it beyond recognition, didn't they? No. For the first 20 years after her lobotomy, the Kennedys did not visit Rosemary at all. Multiple excuses were made for her absence, and it wasn't until Joe Sr. had a stroke in 1961, which left him unable to walk or talk himself, that Rosemary's mother, Rose, finally went to see her daughter and informed the Kennedy siblings of where their sister had really been residing. How messed up is this? Rosemary passed away in 2005 at the age of 86, and although her family were more involved in her life post-1961, with the story about her lobotomy becoming public knowledge in 1987, in my opinion, that simply does not make up for the fact that her life had been altered beyond recognition without her consent. And though Rosemary's story is perhaps one of the most well-known now, there are hundreds, if not thousands of others whose lives were destroyed or ended altogether by this barbaric procedure. For those medical professionals who witnessed the aftermath of the lobotomy rush, I think their feelings on it are generally quite clear. Henry Marsh is one of the UK's most highly regarded neurosurgeons, and early on in his career he saw numerous patients who had previously undergone a lobotomy. Here's what he said about these encounters when speaking to the BBC. Quote, "They had been lobectomized 30 to 40 years ago. They were chronic schizophrenics, and they were often some of the most apathetic, slow, knocked-off patients. It reflected very bad medicine, bad science, because it was clear the patients who were subjected to this procedure were never followed up properly. If you saw the patient after the operation, they'd seem all right. They'd walk and talk and say, 'Thank you, doctor.' The fact they were totally ruined as social human beings probably didn't count." And in a separate interview, he offered up an interesting insight into the surgeons who performed these operations and the culture of surgery at the time, saying, "This business of dividing doctors into heroes and villains is wrong. We are all a mix of both. We are a product of our time, of our culture, of our training. The generation of surgeons who trained me had, I wouldn't say godlike powers, but they had enormous authority. Nobody questioned them or queried them. And I can think of some of the people who trained me who were essentially decent people who had been corrupted by this power and became a little bit monstrous as a result." I wanted to include this quote for the sake of balance, but I'm sure you can guess by this point that my personal thoughts on this are less sympathetic, particularly towards people like Dr. Freeman, who must have realized that at times what he was doing was harming more people than it was helping. As I often say when covering stories like this one, although modern medicine is not perfect, I ultimately feel grateful that the standards of care are now so much better than they were in decades past. Every person who suffered as the result of a lobotomy was a human being who deserved so much better, and the lessons learned from this dark period in medical history should never be forgotten. Well, I hope you're all okay after the heaviness of this topic. I know that at times during my research I struggled a little, but I think it's an important piece of history to cover and understand. As always with episodes like this one, I will be including links to mental health resources in the show notes. I would be fascinated to find out how much you already knew about lobotomies before listening today, and which parts of this episode you found most surprising. For me, something that really stuck out was how relatively recent this lobotomy era felt. You know, in some cases we're still only talking about the 1960s. It's quite shocking the more you think about it. I'll be shouting out all of the ways that you can get in touch and share your thoughts very soon. But first, it's time for our regular outro feature. Here is Weird Media. As much as I would like to tell you that the recommendation I have for you in this feature today is more uplifting than the wider episode topic, I'm afraid that's not exactly the case. However, it is something that I personally found fascinating, and if you're a follower of true crime, then you might too. So back in early September of 2021, I started to notice that a couple of the creators I follow on YouTube were speaking about a then unsolved case that had emerged in the US. The mysterious disappearance of a young woman named Gabby Petito. The case was unfolding live. It was current, and I vividly remember checking every single day for updates about the situation, as it just seemed so incredibly strange. Gabby had been travelling around the US with her boyfriend Brian Laundrie in a van that they were living and working out of. Gabby was filming and documenting their van life journey and had just uploaded the first in a series of YouTube videos she was planning to make when she went completely off the grid, sparking significant concern amongst her family and friends. Shortly after she went missing, Brian turned up at his parents' home in their van alone, and the story developed from there. Now, of course, because I kept up with all of the news at the time, I know how everything concludes. But if this case is new to you, I would very much recommend checking out the new Netflix series dedicated to Gabby's story. It's called American Murder, Gabby Petito. There are a couple of things about the documentary that make it especially impactful, other than the details of the case itself, of course. Firstly, because Gabby was filming so much footage for her YouTube channel while she and Brian were traveling, much of it is used in the documentary, and it feels at times that she's telling her own story, which is both heartbreaking and so compelling to watch. And on top of this, at a couple of points within the show, the filmmakers actually use software to recreate Gabby's voice based on all of her own recordings, and it's used to read out certain things she had written down. This was something her family gave their blessing for, and although they have said that they found it weird to hear, I think it added both a unique and tragic additional dimension to the series. I would be so interested to hear what you made of the documentary if you've watched it. I know that the response has been mixed, but as someone who followed this story from the beginning, I personally found it to be both thoughtfully produced and incredibly moving. Okay, time now for all of the source shoutouts for today's episode. There were the two BBC articles I mentioned. The first was by Hugh Levinson from November 2011, and the second was by Claire Prentice from January 2021. There was a great piece on Wired.com by Annalee Newitz from March 2011, an article from The Guardian by Elizabeth Day from January 2008. We had a piece on the Britannica.com website. That was by Meg Mathias. It was incredibly helpful, as well as a medically reviewed article on WebMD by Parang Mehta from December 2024. Mary Koziol's academic paper, Diagnosing Womanhood, Lessons Learned from Gender Bias in 20th Century Psychiatry, was very insightful indeed, as was an Attitude magazine article by Hugh Kay from April 2023. There was a journal article about Dr. Burkhart by Nicholas et al. From November 2020, a piece on the JFK Library website about Rosemary Kennedy, and finally a piece from All That's Interesting by Katie Serena. That was from November 2024 and was also about Rosemary Kennedy's story. As I say, hearing your thoughts on our stories is always one of my favourite parts of putting any episode live. So here are all of the ways that you can get in touch. On Instagram and Threads, you can find us at Things Get Weird Podcast. On TikTok, we are at Things Are About to Get Weird. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching for the podcast name. Over there, you'll find our main page and our private discussion group. Our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, I would massively appreciate a quick rating or review wherever you're listening. If you're joining us on Spotify, do feel free to leave a comment on the episode page. I absolutely love to read them. Thank you all so much for being here today, and I'll be back soon with a brand new strange but true story for you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.